Thank you, and good morning to everybody, and thank you for coming along. So what I'm going to do in this initial talk, I guess 20-25 minutes, is two or three things. Firstly, to give some thoughts about how at least I read the current situation in Syria, a little bit in Iraq and a little bit in Lebanon too. Then talk a little bit about the book itself, and finally a couple of thoughts about where things may be headed. We have a map there which shows the current divisions in Syria, Iraq and Lebanon. It is fairly accurate up until the moment, the most accurate one that we at least could find. To get straight to it then, let me say the following. We are, of course, around 7 years into a process of very profound convulsion from below in the Arabic-speaking world. The series of revolutions, counter-revolutions, civil wars, initially misnamed the Arab Spring. Nobody calls it that anymore, but you know what we're talking about. My own contention, and that of many other observers of this process, is that we may well currently be in the closing stages, at least of this particular episode of grassroots unrest that has, in some ways at least, transformed the region. Now, in the space in which we're interested, the space between the Iraq-Iran border and the Mediterranean Sea, taking in the states or notional states of Iraq, Syria and Lebanon, in my contention, that process of uprising and civil war, colliding with, in a certain sense, two prior existing processes, namely the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the fallout deriving from that, and the Iranian project of outreach, so to speak, into neighbouring states and building of proxies. The collision of these three processes has in effect led to a current situation in which today, between the Iraq-Iran border and the Mediterranean Sea, there is no single normally functioning state, or at least there is no single functioning state that performs 100% of the functions we would generally expect of modern states, up to and including, of course, Thomas Hobbes's definition being the monopoly on the means and application of violence in the area notionally under its rule. What there is, rather, then, is a kind of complex patchwork of areas of control carved out and controlled, for the most part, by political/military organizations, for the most part based on ethnic or sectarian or to some degree perhaps also tribal basis, and a sort of ongoing war over the ruins of the states in question fought out between those various entities, some of which at least notionally regard themselves as and describe themselves as the official government of the state in question, others of which do not, but each of which has much more in common in a certain sense with all the others than it has with a normally functioning state entity. What I want to do then is to, in a moment, go through, in a certain sense, go through these various bits of colour on the map and describe a little bit, at least in a little bit of detail, what the entity in question is. Prior to saying that, however, let me first of all note in addition that in addition to this quite complex patchwork, there's another patchwork you have to put on top of it, and that is the patchwork, of course, of competition between various regional and global state players within this space. Because, of course, with the single exception of the now crumbling or declining Islamic State, which is marked in this map in grey, the small areas in grey in question it still controls, with the single exception of the Islamic State, all the other entities in question are backed up by, and indeed made possible by, only by the support of sponsorship of this or that regional or global player. So it's a complex sort of double patchwork. Briefly then, let's look from west to east. Of course, I haven't got a pointer here, but perhaps I can play around like that. Oh, there we are. That's good. Here we are. In the orange there we have, of course, Lebanon, which is the easiest one to talk about, because Lebanon, territorially speaking, of course, remains intact. But many would argue, and I'm among them, that it's difficult to speak today of a functioning state called Lebanon, and what we have is something much more interesting, which is a situation in which an existing state has been to a great extent swallowed up by a non-state actor, a powerful non-state military political actor, namely Hezbollah, to the extent where not only can Hezbollah, as it's been clear since 2006 and 2008, conduct its own foreign policy and make its own decisions, ignoring the wishes of the official state, but also, at least since 2016, that non-state entity has now begun the process of swallowing up or absorbing the official state. Of course, in the Lebanese cabinet today, 17 out of 30 portfolios controlled by the March 8th coalition, the Hezbollah controlled, the Hezbollah associated list, etc., etc. So Lebanon's an easy one to look at. Syria, of course, is the main focus of our meeting today, and indeed is the least simple one to understand. For those of you who can see the map, I hope everybody can. Of course, people are probably familiar with this. The pink is the area controlled by the Assad regime and its allies. The remaining Sunni Arab rebel areas in Tanif there over to the east, in Dara and Quneitra in the southwest, eastern Ghouta there in the middle, Rastan up in the north, and then Idlib further north in the northwest are the areas still controlled by the various iterations now in decline and retreat of the Sunni Arab rebellion that broke out, of course, in mid-March 2011. The grey I already mentioned is the now declining Arab Islamic State. Of course, the area there in northern Hama, and areas there in Deir ez-Zor, a last little border area right at the bottom there facing Iraqi border. But of course, we need to remember with regard to Islamic State, whilst we may talk about territorial decline, whilst we may talk about the potential eclipse of the Islamic State as an area controlling territory, let's be careful to remember that the Islamic State first emerged, of course, as the Al-Qaeda branch in Iraq, then as Islamic State in Iraq, and only later on morphed from a network and an insurgency into a quasi-state, and may well now be in the process of morphing back. We should bear in mind the very large degree of support the Islamic State still clearly enjoys, particularly in the western provinces of Iraq, which we can't really note here because it's just in purple to note it's under Iraqi control. But in Diyala province, in Anbar province, we can see, which is close to the border there with Syria, we can note very clear patterns of ISIS support. Also to some degree around Mosul, a military parade conducted by ISIS in mid-January, just west of Mosul city, around I think 142 members of the Iraqi security forces killed by ISIS since October. So yes, territorial decline, but decline morphing back into an insurgency. The yellow, of course, in the northeast of Syria, the very large area now controlled, around 28% of the territory, controlled by the Syrian Kurds, in alliance, of course, with the United States. We mentioned the pink as being Assad regime, of course, advancing now in conquest, most notably in the northwestern corner there, where the regime is pushing into Idlib province, the last province entirely under rebel control, just taken the Abdul air base. They're now, I think, 10 kilometers from a town called Sarakib, which will be the next gain they'll almost undoubtedly make in the weeks ahead. Moving on to Iraq, yes, an enormous great area in purple there, controlled, of course, by the official government of Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi. And to the northeast, the area controlled by Kurdish regional government, or the autonomous, quasi-sovereign to some degree, body controlled by Iraqi Kurds since the early 1990s. But again, this picture needs to be complicated if we were to benignly conclude, as some, I think, less sophisticated analysis has done, that the Iraqi state has now been reborn, the moment of crisis is over, and we're back to control and government by institutions in Iraq. We need to complicate that picture very severely. First of all, of course, because the northeastern corner conducted a referendum on September 25th of last year, in which 92% of people voted to extricate themselves from the Iraqi state, and have then effectively been prevented by force from doing so. But secondly, and no less interestingly, because even the area marked in purple, as those of us, Michael and I and others probably in this room, who spend a certain amount of time in Iraq, the notion that that area is uncomplicatedly governed by Haider al-Abadi and his official security forces is optimistic in the extreme. We mentioned, of course, the Hashd al-Shabi, the PMU, Popular Mobilization Unit, still in existence, carrying arms and acting according to their own will or those of their controllers, perhaps in other countries, once you're outside of Baghdad. And this is something which we'll discuss later on in a bit more detail. I'm rushing on ahead because I don't want to leave too much time from our conversation. Thus, that then is an absolute whistle-stop tour through the areas of control. So Abadi, of course, but with ISIS still active on the ground, and Shia militias active in Iraq. KRG, Democratic Federation of Northern Syria, as it's now called, or rather Rojava, of northeastern Syria under control of the Kurds. Remnants of Islamic State, Assad regime advancing, remnants of the rebellion now in retreat, and Lebanon effectively under control of Hezbollah. Now, That's one layer of the map. I promise to note the no less interesting and no less important second layer of state control and state sponsorship, so to speak, of the various entities in question. We discussed Lebanon already. Lebanon effectively under the iron hand, so to speak, of Iran-supported paramilitary organisation, party Hezbollah. If we look towards Syria, we encounter an interesting debate, because there is, of course, a very strong view of Syria today that parallels the view of Iraq, namely that the Syrian state is now on the way back. That what looked like a fragmented space 2 years ago has now reversed itself, and that the regime, Assad regime, is in the process of re-establishing itself across the territory of Syria. We need to complicate this view for the following reason, in my estimation, because it's quite true that the pink on the map is getting broader, yeah? That the regime-controlled area is increasing. But the thing that is increasing its power is a very, very different entity to the Assad regime that existed prior to March 15th, 2011. So to speak. If we look at the balance of power today, very clearly notable events between the regime and its backers, the Russians and the Iranians, we see that it is not the regime which is calling the most important shots in Syria today with regard to regime activity. Let's look at a public example of recent days. As we know, on January 20th, the Turks launched their Operation Olive Branch, wonderfully named. Let's offer some congratulations to the Turks on a truly inspired choice of name, into Idlib province there in the northwest. Now, fascinatingly, as you will have noted, those of you who watch Syria closely, the Syrian government issued a series of blood-curdling warnings against the Turks before they launched that operation. On Sana'a itself, and then Deputy Foreign Minister Faisal Miqdad issued statements saying, "We will blast any Turkish planes that enter Syrian airspace out of the sky." I'm paraphrasing, but more or less a direct quote. Now that, of course, did not deter the Turks from launching Operation Olive Branch. Why did it not deter the Turks from launching Operation Olive Branch? Because very clearly, it's not the Syrian government today that decides which planes do or do not get blasted out of the sky over the skies of Syria. It is rather Putin's Russia, because of the presence of 2 S-400 batteries in Latakia province. This is an example of the extent to which the so-called returning regime is not in fact a sovereign regime at all. It is rather a regime absolutely dependent on the support of the Russians in the air, the Russians in the diplomatic halls of the world, and the Iranians and their tens of thousands of Shia volunteer militiamen on the ground, especially in the south, but also even taking part in the operation in the northwest from what we hear. So with regard to Syria, the presence of the Russians and Iranians is absolutely crucial. We talked about Lebanon already. In Iraq also, if we look at the government-controlled part of Iraq, yes, the Iraqi state is returning. But what is this Iraqi state? I read yesterday that President Trump in December has voted to allow financial assistance to the Iraqi Interior Ministry as part of America's outreach into Iraq and the helping of Iraq to rebuild institutions. What is the Iraqi Interior Ministry? Those of you who follow Iraq will know very well. Who is the minister? Qasem al-Arajli. What party does he come from? Badr. What is Badr? Badr is a political military organization linked directly to the Iranians. So what is this Iraqi government exactly, this Iraqi state which is returning? When the Interior Ministry that controls the police force, both the federal police and the regular police in Baghdad, is controlled by Badr, and Badr answers, Hadi al-Amri, as we know, answers directly to Qasem Soleimani, who answers directly to Ali Khamenei. This is the Iraqi state which is returning, and of course there are elections coming up in May 12th. And contrary to American wishes and contrary to Abadi's wishes, the militias are standing in a united list, the Fatah list, in the elections that may well be holding key portfolios after May. So the notion of the state coming back has to be complicated in Iraq too. Now what do all three examples have in common, Lebanon, government, Syria and Iraq? They have in common that the upper hand, the most sophisticated program of outreach, so to speak, is being conducted by Islamic Republic of Iran. Unlike all the other countries we can mention in a moment, Iran sees this whole area as a single space and is operating a policy sort of across borders in which when Assad gets into trouble you can bring Iraqi militiamen to help him, when Assad needs assistance that Hezbollah comes from Lebanon to help him, and so on and so forth. A single policy across state lines. But of course there are other powers to be noted on this map. You think about the Americans, think about the Turks, think about the Russians. In all three of those cases, however, it would seem to me, there is a much more complex and partial picture. No clear policy across all state lines is being conducted. I won't spend an enormous amount of time on each, just to note a couple of things. Firstly, American policy remains, in my estimation, at least confused. There isn't a policy which you can discern a logic across all three spaces. America still committed notionally to the idea of an independent Lebanese state outside of Hezbollah control. Still notionally committed to the bringing down of Assad, the toppling of Assad, but no real actions being taken thereof. Committed to its ongoing alliance with the Syrian Kurds, as Satterfield, Tillerson, and Mattis indeed have confirmed in recent statements in recent weeks, but at the same time also committed to the alliance with Turkey, and therefore annoying the Syrian Kurdish allies very much by the fact that they're not helping west of the Euphrates the Kurds fight their current battle in Afrin province up there in the northwestern tip against Turkish aggression.
Where is Afrin?
Afrin is here. That's Afrin. You can see that this is as far as where Jazeera Canton reaches, and the Kurdish ambition has been, of course, to link up the two cantons, and that effectively is what Turkish action has been most determined to prevent. The Turks, of course, coming in August 2016 to create that little green enclave between Jarablus and Azaz, and now coming in to Afrin itself to try to sort of lop off the Afrin canton. So American policy, I think we can say, confused and still emergent. Hopefully it will emerge at some stage, and calling it emergent is a way of being complimentary. And lastly, the issue of the Russians. Well, Russia, of course, it would be fashionable in a gathering like this to say, well, the Russians have a clear policy, the Russians know what they're doing, the Russians always get what they want, Putin's a strategic master and the whole thing. And we need to complicate that view a little bit as well, in two ways. Firstly, we need to remember that the Russian intervention on September 30th, 2015 into Syria, which undoubtedly did turn the tide of the war, but this was not a strategic masterstroke. This actually was an exercise in putting out fires. Let's not forget, the insurgency was tantalizingly close to victory in the summer of 2015. For the first time, it had got its act together. There was a single powerful rebel force in northern Syria, Jaish al-Fatah. It was heading westwards towards Latakia. Had it broken into Latakia, it would have been game over for the regime. That's what the Russians came in to prevent. So first of all, it wasn't a strategic masterstroke, it was putting out a fire. But secondly, and even more fascinatingly, in recent days in Sochi, I think we have witnessed the way in which even Russia, the normal rules of diplomacy apply even to Russia. Russia in Sochi demonstrated how it is not that easy to turn a military achievement into a political achievement. Yes, the Russians have defended the existence of Assad regime. But what we note in Sochi is that the Russians proved entirely unable to turn that into political gain. Couldn't get the opposition to turn up, couldn't get the Kurds to turn up. The regime, of course, did turn up, but was not happy entirely with the results, and the British, French and Americans, of course, have no intention of going anywhere near it. And given that Syria apparently requires $300 billion for reconstruction, that's an important factor too. The Russians have managed to preserve their ally. They have not managed, however, to dominate the space of Syria to such an extent as to be able to dictate the outcome. And Sochi, I think, shows that very graphically. Finally, for another 5 minutes or so, I don't want to go on and on, my book, Days of the Fall. What is Days of the Fall all about? Days of the Fall is all about what I've just been talking about. It's about an attempt to trace how that current reality came into being, and to trace the various chapters of the Syrian wars in Iraq from their outset, and from a vantage point of voices from below. In other words, I spent a great deal of time reporting in Syria and Iraq over the last 6 or 7 years. I've managed, I think, certainly I've managed to speak to voices from all of these various sides noted here. I haven't quite managed to enter all the spaces in question. The single area that I didn't enter was that of Islamic State, but I did interview members of Islamic State in southern Turkey. So it's an attempt to try to trace the various chapters of the war from below. So we begin in the moment of birth of the insurgency in early 2012, in the winter of 2011-2012, when the armed insurgency was just getting going in Idlib province. And we speak to many of the, or some of the recently defected soldiers and officers from Assad's armed forces. At that moment, before the jihadis and the Islamists had come into the northern Syrian countryside, when there genuinely and tantalizingly was a possibility, in my contention at least, of a quite different force emerging. And we follow that force then into Aleppo later on in the year as it bursts into Syria's second city, its greatest strategic gain, of course, of the war, and the very, very bloody fighting that took place as the regime strove to drive the rebellion out of Aleppo. And then we go eastwards and we witness the birth of Kurdish quasi-sovereignty in that yellow space there up in the northeast of Syria. The first very fascinating embryonic developments that have now led, of course, to a very solid, surprisingly perhaps, solid authority there in northeastern Syria. But as Michael and I were sharing some memories before this talk, how very, very rough and ready it was in early 2013. The IHS and the YPG didn't even have uniforms at that stage. A great deal of hope and optimism and a great deal of determination. And then, of course, the emergence of Islamic State out of the Sunni Arab insurgency. As we should remember, it did emerge. It didn't arrive from out of the sky. It arrived from out of the insurgency. And then ISIS's dramatic turn eastwards in the summer of 2014, as it crashes through the Iraqi army's defences and Peshmerga's defences and menaces both Erbil and Baghdad. And we speak to people in real time. I was there at that time in Iraq and also in Syria, and travelled very closely to Sinjar Mountain at the time when there was around 20,000 Yazidis, of course, besieged by and menaced by the forces of the Islamic State at that time. And we take the reader, so to speak, into the Nuruz refugee camp, the hastily assembled, very, very primitive refugee camp that the Syrian Kurds created to bring down 20,000 Yazidis in that summer and save their lives, effectively, having broken course through to Sinjar Mountain from northeastern Syria. And we look also at the interesting emergence of Shia militia power, the rise of the Shia militias in 2014, 2015 as an independent, or at least independent of government control in Iraq, political and military power in the country. We turn back and take a second look at the rebellion in its dying days, if one could put it that way, in late 2016, or at least its moment of twilight and eclipse in late 2016, and the emergence, I think insufficiently reported, by the way, the emergence of a kind of semi-permanent Syrian presence in southern Turkey, with all the usual emergent patterns of long-term settlement. People starting to marry Turks, people starting to learn Turkish, people finding work in southern Turkey, the sense that they may not be going home, the sense that, well, this arrangement and the survival and perhaps also victory of the regime is looking to look more and more solid by the day. And we conclude the book with a trip into Assad Syria itself, into Damascus, Homs and Aleppo, and a look at Aleppo city from the other side, having earlier in the book looked at Aleppo city at neighbourhoods such as the Shah neighbourhood and Bustan, al-Bashar and others, at the height of the fighting there. We then, at the conclusion of the book, go back and look at the ruins of eastern Aleppo as they are now. Very little remaining of buildings, forget about it, but also of infrastructure, of electricity, of water provision, and of course of population. Very little remaining, and a witness to the way in which 20th century methods of aerial warfare, at least in the absence of mass media, can prove still very, very effective in a military context, and the quite shocking way in which the rebellion was broken in Aleppo province. And we conclude by an observation, which I sort of hinted at earlier, namely that at least in the contention of this author, the notion of a return to strong states in Iraq and Syria is deeply misguided, and what needs to be observed is the emergence of semi-permanent frameworks and entities in a patchwork holding power across both countries. And in that regard, let me just conclude with 2 or 3 predictions, I suppose, or observations of where things may be going. Just the following. I already said regarding the regime, the penetration of the regime by Russian and Iranian power, and the extent to which it is today the Russians and Iranians taking the key decisions on the ground in regime-controlled Syria, is something which the importance of which cannot be overstated. I think it's absolutely crucial for clear analysis to be looking very, very closely at that situation. Comparable to that reality, the Syrian Arab rebels, what remains of the Sunni Arab rebellion today, I'm sorry to say, is not a revolution, is not even really an insurgency. What it is it is a series of military contractors, armed men, needing money, who effectively work for the interests of a number of foreign governments. That is to say, who are the ground force that Turkey is taking to Afrin today? It's not Turkish infantry. It's organisations with such heroic ringing names as Jabhat al-Shamiyya, Nur-ad-Din al-Zinki, Faylaq al-Sham. The remnants of the rebellion from northern Syria are today working in the north of the country for the interests of the Turkish government. And comparably, in southwest Syria today, rebel militias, the Southern Front, Forsan al-Jawlan, working for the Jordanians or for Israel in various different localized contexts. Comparable to the fate of the regime, the fate of the rebellion has been to end up as contractors for foreign governments, operating in their own interests on the ruins of Syria and Iraq. And of course, to add to the same pattern, the Kurdish YPG today. Perhaps the most fascinating marriage of all, the effective marriage today between a franchise of the PKK organisation in northeastern Syria and the government of the United States. And what's truly fascinating about it is that it's working out quite well. The American DoD has actually found a group of ground partners who, one, quite genuinely, whatever else they may be, are not Sunni jihadis, and who, two, are actually pretty good at ground combat when it comes to the issue of light infantry combat. So a fascinating parallel example with regard to northeast Syria. So just to conclude then to say the following. What we've witnessed, in my estimation, as you've probably gathered over the last 7 years, is the demise, effectively, of those states that existed as powerful entities for the best part of the last half century or 70 or 80 years, and we're still in the process of witnessing the birth of what may be to come. I wouldn't wish to conclude without noting that my book, Those Are the Fall, and also a great deal of my work and attention is on the human cost of that, and not only the political implications of it. And of course, in Syria, just to think of the numbers reminds us of the staggering extent of the human tragedy. Around perhaps 500,000 dead, around 6 million refugees, perhaps around 6 million internal refugees, 5 to 6 million external refugees. A country effectively destroyed by the events of the last 7 years, with uncertainty as to where this may be heading. So, on that note, I'll stop this initial address. I look forward very much to our conversation, and I hope you've found this to be of some interest. Thanks.